Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of RTFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update into modern audio standards. This particular story is called Humans Are Cheating Bastards, written by Chipating. It had been 2 weeks since Dave had bastardized the game I loved. 2 weeks of watching every bit of casual player run circles around AOA club members with Dave's infernal tactics. Of course, counters were found. Many of us dusted off old memory cores not used in centuries to find answers. I was shocked to learn that before my time, Dave's strategy was common and matches could last decades as the remaining players wore down each other. What shocked us most of all was that the father of our strategy, Alpha of Strategy Order Guardian of the Fifth House, created the flowing sword strategy to wipe out fleets such as the one Dave had made. Supposedly, if dubious rumors are to be believed, he missed his only child's birth and graduation during a grueling game. Both he and his opponents had been hospitalized and were infirm the rest of their lives as a result. That was why he created Flowing Hand, to end matches quickly. It had been perfected by younger masters and adopted as our method. Dave, though, he saw what we didn't. He saw us for the fools we were. He knew every action we would take before we did. We had become complacent. Where we competed to perfect maneuvers handed down through generations, Dave played to win. It was a mistake, but I had learned dearly and one I did not anticipate on repeating. What was needed was a new match, not one where Dave was left alone to create his devious machine of war. We gathered all around the table to begin the new game. As usual, before the game had even begun, the Nakota were already establishing their intricate network of diplomacy and preparatory backstabs. The Bergen word-bearer had also joined. We knew little about him other than the nature of his kind. His family was one of the few that ruled over the Bergen war clans by matter of being able to plan and think. He still carried the Bergen tradition of only speaking when needed and in as few words as possible. Then there was Dave. My skin became dark purple as we locked eyes from across the room. There was an excited energy at the table. The atmosphere was different. Fear, excitement, and stress all rolled into one. The game was set. We began. The first turn revealed some surprising results. Half my starting planets were large gas giants with H3 in them, and I had enough habitable worlds to get a strong technology lead early on. My only concern was the lack of base materials. In that past, you were safe for the first 2 or 3 sessions. There was no such quarter in this game, though. Raids were early and vicious. I lost many merchant vessels to opportunistic players. With each passing turn, my head ached and my lips itched. What had once been a duel of wit and precision had become a melee with no mercy. No move was too low, and no tactic too cruel. My early settlements were defended from ground invasion, but my space station was under near constant attack. It was the 4th session. Buildings and equipment that had never seen extensive use were now hugely instrumental. Ground-based anti-ship guns dotted every major colony, and no mining station was complete without a military outpost. The raids became bigger and bigger as we fought to survive. Eklar was on the warpath, carving through his neighboring opponents, and Dave had gone silent as he examined his territories and weighed his options. I wasn't sure what he was planning, but I didn't want a repeat of last time. I needed to ensure my place in this campaign. As it turned out, helium-3 was in short supply, and my well-defended gas giants held the main source of it. I used a researcher to found a currency backed by my H3 reserves. I was pleasantly surprised to see raids on my territory dwindle. Everyone who wanted H3 had to play by my rules. If you didn't have helium-3, most common forms of FTL were impossible without cumbersome technology. And when it came time to decide who was allowed to get my currency, it was very convenient to leave Dave out of the trade agreement. Try fighting without FTL, Dave. I dare you. As it turns out, Dave took that as a challenge. Session 14 rolled around, much as 13 had. A few players had been bumped off, including Eklar, who found out the hard way that a full-front war was not a sound military strategy. His systems were squabbled over by his neighbors, who then began to fight over his highly developed worlds. Dave still hadn't sent out an invasion fleet or a raiding party, in large part because without my H3 reserves, he was stranded. Yet he was still smiling. I hate Dave. Have I mentioned that because I feel that it needs repeating. Players nearby Dave began to complain about FTL artillery being a nuisance, but again, I thought nothing of it. You could soften up a target with FTL artillery from the safety of your own system, but you couldn't conquer with it. Turns went by, and the occasional FTL artillery shot would hit. Again a nuisance, and loss of population was annoying, but not crippling. Another session went by, and suddenly Dave began rolling for his scientists. On success, fleets began appearing in players' systems. My eye twitched as I tried to figure it out. He couldn't have a fleet. He needed hundreds of years to reach the nearest planet. Roger Jar fought off an invading fleet with ease, and we'd assumed that would be the end of it. If the best Dave could do was send a fleet 100 years out of date at a time, then we were confident that he was merely a paper tiger. He wasn't. Just throwing that out there, we seriously need to stop underestimating humans. Another turn later, an even larger fleet appeared in Rodigar's empire, and again he fought it off without casualties. I asked if I could examine one of the destroyed ships. Rodigar sent over an incomplete ship template sheet to simulate a wrecked ship. I was puzzled as to why a ship as small as a corvette had so many repair modules in it. One of them was an ancient first-gen version, and it had only short-range communication systems and no fuel. Only solar sails and ancient ion drives. This made no sense. Dave had rewritten the book on ship design overnight with his templates. Why was he suddenly using some of the weakest weapons in the game? Another turn later, 2 fleets arrived in Rodigar's empire. This time, though, they were advanced and brand new. Again with solar sails and ion engines. We all agreed that it was impossible without FTL to be able to send new ships. The AI stated that no rules had been broken. Rodigar suffered minor casualties, but beat back the fleets. A fleet similar to the first that Rodigar had fought arrived in system. Dave was getting suspicious looks. I sent out a rogue in my fastest ship to find out what was going on in Dave's empire. It took an entire session for the ship to arrive. In that time, I saw the entirety. It's what happens when you need to travel to the other end of the galaxy. His planets were all well developed and had bustling high development colonies everywhere. He had transport vessels and vast networks of colony shipyards pumping out generation ships. What was concerning, though, was the lack of any shipyards for military ships. What he did have, though, was the biggest and most advanced FTL artillery that I've ever seen in any game of AOA. Every turn, every available population unit was producing the power and ammunition to feed the towering guns. Every turn, at least 50 of these guns were firing. I attempted to have my rogue flee, but Dave caught on to my scheme and dispatched a squadron of corvettes and frigates to destroy my stealth ship. I was still wondering how Dave had managed to build a fleet without shipyards. I had sent out a research vessel to Ekbar's former territory to search some old weapon systems I hadn't been able to research. Well then, an FTL artillery shell impacted the planet. I rolled to investigate the impact with my researcher. It had hit an abandoned world that was only mined for minimal population. On further inspection, the shell was a tungsten jacket wrapped around a repair core with a mining probe and refinery. Dave looked at me and congratulated me on finding his weapon. I was more confused than anything. As if on cue, larger and larger fleets of Dave's Ghost Navy appeared and began attacking neighboring systems. Each turn, the fleets got bigger and bigger, until the defenders were forced to flee with however much population they could muster. A refugee crisis had emerged in our gaming board as more and more players were forced away from their planets. On the front lines where refugees were fleeing, the ghost fleets, some players opted to allow their unfortunate neighbors to flee while others blew up any transports coming into their space. In either case, the fleets kept on coming. By the time the 17th session ended, every neighboring empire today was driven away or locked into a meat grinder war they had no hope of winning. However, the fleet stopped advancing and the artillery ceased firing. Any foray into formerly held territory was met with insurmountable numbers. Even ship designs copied straight from Dave's first game were no use against the sheer numbers. Scout ships detected generation colony ships entering Rodigar's former territory. As the sole provider of H3 for what was left of our territory, I offered it freely to anyone who was willing to ally to hold ground against Dave. Our alliance brought us closer than anything I'd experienced. There were no double-sided games to our agreements, and despite my better judgment, concessions were made that did not benefit me at all. We were allies, and I genuinely cared about keeping other players in the game. I knew if we beat Dave here, my H3 monopoly would assure a victory anyways. But against everything I'd learned, I didn't care. It wasn't about superiority. It was about my allies. Dave, you've broken me. My family is one of the 14 houses, and I was raised to lead the Varlands through decisive action and ruthless precision. While most learned to not pick at their mandibles, I was being taught to conquer empires. Why in the name of Alpha did I care about those who were not me? Damn you, Dave! Our alliance waited and built up. Without petty politics, our unified fleet benefited from more than half the galaxy of resources. With surplus of every conceivable material, our fleets were the height of naval technology. After 20 turns, the artillery resumed. Knowing what I did, I ensured that the impacts were scoured and destroyed. Dave smiled and nodded at me as I grew wise to his plan. I would not be defeated, not by a human. I'd given up so much to ensure victory, I wasn't about to make a mistake now. The artillery continued to pound away at our planets. When scouting vessels appeared in our frontier, our fortifications annihilated them. I spread out our fleets to find out how his fleets were infiltrating our borders. Players who'd experienced Dave's wrath began to panic. I didn't blame them. Behind my natural leadership, I was worried. Genuinely scared even as to what Dave was planning. Our fortifications and defense armies began seeing entire bases set up in worlds that belonged to us, all entirely automated. It was all beginning to click together. I never bothered to look into the repair module much. Any ship that was damaged could go to the shipyard or use a parasite drone. A repair module was just a waste of space. But these were advanced beyond anything I'd seen before, capable of repairing a corvette in a turn, or in this case turning one out. I couldn't believe it. Even deprived of the most crucial resource, he developed a war-winning solution. I knew what had to be done. I assembled our fleets to the fullest strength and made the order. Reserve and garrison fleets would hunt down and destroy any replicating seed they found, while our fleets passed forward and used our biggest advantage, our FTL. It was a two-pronged war on a scale that dwarfed even my first bout with Dave. It was rather entertaining seeing Dave alone in his end of the table, surrounded on all sides by dozens of fleet cards and planet sheets. Our combined fleet planned out and began to hunt. A single battleship from our fleet was more than a match for an entire fleet's worth of ships that Dave had at his disposal. And we weren't blinded by ego and nepotism this time. We were efficient and retaking ground at twice the rate we lost it. However, as we got closer and closer to the core of Dave's territory, the fleets came in greater pace and more advanced than the last. Try as we may, with every victory we tasted defeat. Every strategy was countered in a few turns, regardless of requirements. The tendrils of Dave's seed's fleets began to spread further. No matter how quickly we replaced losses, he replaced them quicker. When we built planetary shields to protect our systems from FTL seeds, he rammed battleship-sized seed clusters into them. I spent weeks locked in a trance, unable to concentrate on anything but defeating Dave. Food had no taste, and all that I wanted to do was study the books of the alphas before me. The ruthless efficiency of it was mind-numbing. I lost sleep, I lost weight to the point where my scholarly frame was reduced to a meek skin and bones. With sullen red eyes, I returned for the match, only to find Dave sitting at the table alone, reading through a book. He wasn't smiling. He looked at me, and I could see immediately that his body was in a similar state to mine. I could see the individual veins in his eyes. It was unsettling. I asked where the others were. He motioned to the desk where dozens of notifications of planets succeeded to me. I smiled meekly and sat down at the table opposite to Dave. I'd sat at that chair for years, reading over it with the might of the magistrate Alpha. I sighed. It didn't feel the same anymore. I asked Dave if he was ready. He agreed, and we began the game. It was a blur of management and perfection. I turned out my fleet much the same way Dave had, and we hit each other with everything we had. The world outside didn't matter to us. Hours zipped by, and night became day. My fingers swiped at holograms that I had no recollection of seeing. My body acted independently while my mind was in deep trance. Numbers and ideas collected in my head. This went on until physical exhaustion overcame me, and I awoke from my trance. Dave stared at the hologram, his eyes unmoving. My body screamed for nourishment. I looked at Dave hesitantly. I asked if he needed to take a break. The word startled Dave. He asked if I needed a break. We both agreed and stumbled half asleep to the dining hall. We piled our plates high and sat down at one end of the secluded tables near the library. Dave balanced 4 drink containers and placed them down on the table. He explained that they were good for staying awake. I wasn't sure, as one of the drinks appeared to be hot enough to scald flesh and was the coloration of feces, and the other had an appearance of taste of carbonated urine. The drinks were unpleasant to drink, but had an immediate effect. Dave and I spoke for the first time as peers in over a year. Between mouthfuls of food, we discussed the game and our plans, and it became readily clear that no one was going to win without a serious commitment. I told him the story of my hero and the infirm state that he ended up in as a result of his strategies. Dave reached out his hand, and as he had when we first met, he offered to call it a tie. I was unfamiliar with the concept. He explained that when 2 sides of a conflict cannot overcome the other, instead of losing more, they agreed to end the conflict without deciding a victor. It took a few explanations to get the idea, but he persisted. With a weak hand, I grasped his and shook it. As sweaty as his hand was, I still look back on that moment with fond memories. We spoke for a great deal of time over warm food and disgusting stimuli drinks. We agreed on most subjects and fiercely debated on others, but one thing we had the same opinion on was that it would be a loss to not play AOA again. We'd ruined each other in a way, as funny as it sounds. We were both leagues ahead of anyone in the academy, and to join the ranks of the strategy alphas required 1-session games, ensuring that you'd spend much of your life locked into a game for months at a time. Put simply, we were too good for the game to result in anything more than a tie without committing our lives to the game we would no longer enjoy. It was the story of Olwyn the Immortal all over again. 2 immortal brothers trapped forever in a duel, neither willing to surrender and unable to die. The only winning move was to not play at all. We ended up leaving the club after that. To my surprise, membership enrollment spiked when we left. Perhaps the prospect of being able to win a game drew the casual players out of the shadows. Dave and I still visited whenever there were sessions in progress. We would give out advice to the players, which they would inevitably follow. We kept track of dozens of games at a time, watching to see how they played out. Our only rule was that we could not tell them what to make, only advise them and give ideas. We competed in our own way still, finding rivalries and guiding them from behind the chair. When we got too invested, we would remove ourselves from the table and watch the results. When we graduated that year, we did so with honors. Not being locked into matches for days at a time allowed us to catch up and then some. After the ceremony, we accepted our ceremonial swords. I introduced Dave to my family and me to his. After that, we agreed to never allow our families to interact with one another ever again. The prospects for us were endless, though I doubt graduation was the last time we would see each other. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.